You registered a few who could not be here today, as well as yourselves, and this will also be posted to our dedicated YouTube channel and on our website. So please do bear that in mind. You see here our agenda. I will go in a bit more detail with regards to what each person is going to speak about right before we call them up. So why don't I just go ahead? I'm going to see if we need to skip Sanisha or potentially start with Kate. Anna, how are we doing in terms of Sanisha? I know he was not feeling so well. Has he been able to join?
Not at the present. So I think, Kate, it would be great if we could start with you, and hopefully we'll resume with Sanisha afterwards.
Wonderful. Okay, well, hope he's well enough to join. So just very briefly, we're joined here by Kate Turner. We'll start off with her. She is the chair of the Armed Conflict Subgroup of the Human Rights Working Group at the Responsible Investment Association Australasia. And they have just put out an investor toolkit on human rights and armed conflict. We're going to pop that into the chat here for a second if you want to take a closer look at that while she's speaking. And we've asked Kate to speak to a couple of items. First of all, we've asked Kate to talk a little bit about why investors should care about their portfolio company's exposure to armed conflict and what kind of risks that their investments may be exposed to. And then also, what do responsible investment activities look like prior, during, and after an armed conflict? And in particular, what kind of leverage can investors bring to bear in those types of scenarios? So Kate, I'm just going to hand it over to you. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much. So I guess just a bit of background on me. My day job is that I'm the Global Head of Responsible Investment at First Century Investors, but we are a member of RIA. I'm an active participant in the Human Rights Working Group, as Rebecca mentioned. And one of the activities of that group is to produce toolkits. They're written by investors for investors, and a little over a year ago, we decided to produce one on armed conflict, which is showing up in the chat at the moment. And in terms of the background behind that, I think for me personally, when the Russia-Ukraine conflict escalated last year, there was a lot of discussion in the broader industry about compliance with sanctions, which of course is very important. But I think that kind of repeated question of, are we complying with sanctions, felt like the wrong question to be asked from a responsible investment practitioner standpoint. Because if we're complying with sanctions, but the companies that we invest in are causing, contributing, or directly linked to human rights violations or breaches of international humanitarian law, then we're not following the UNGPs. There's obviously a series of risks for us as investors as well. So we put this toolkit out. It's broken down into why investors should care, how to identify risk, and once that risk has been identified, how to manage it. So I'll speak to each of those points. So in terms of sort of the why investors should care, we did spend quite a bit of time on this, and I have had many conversations on this topic over the last year and a bit. But I think in terms of the risks that companies are exposed to, we know that the poor management of human rights risks and not either understanding or operating within the bounds of international humanitarian law can create financial, legal, and reputational risks for companies. And we really try and make our toolkits as practical as possible. So we've filled the toolkit with examples of this and stepped through each of those risks and why. And it wasn't hard to find examples of companies doing this poorly, to be honest. We really struggled to find examples of companies doing it well, unfortunately. One of the many companies that we profile in the toolkit was Lafarge, who was found guilty of aiding and abetting crimes against humanity for its involvement in Syria's civil war and for the deals that provided funding to Islamic State. So it's a great example because last year we know a US district court ordered it to pay $778 million in fines and forfeiture. It's also had charges confirmed against it in France for complicity in crimes against humanity in Syria, and it's also facing charges for deliberately endangering the lives of Syrian employees. So there are many examples of this, which I think is really speaks to why investors should care about it. In terms of sort of the next part of the toolkit, we really went into, well, now we know why we should care, how do we go and identify that risk? And I think that's almost, for me, was almost the trickiest piece, because I think on one level, knowing where conflicts are might sound straightforward, but it isn't necessarily. There's these blurry lines between what is and isn't an armed conflict, when it's escalating, and when perpetrators are trying to sort of purposefully provide little information. It can be hard to get good information, but getting past that, I think then knowing how your portfolio is connected to these conflicts isn't always obvious, and there are challenges with, especially with large portfolios, but even with smaller portfolios, when it comes to where the company's operations are, their supply chain, their joint venture data, or where their products and services might be used in ways and forms that they didn't anticipate, for example. And then I think another challenge is the fact that human rights violations aren't necessarily confined to the countries where the conflict is taking place. So even if we have all that data, it's not necessarily still easy to pinpoint how a portfolio is exposed to the risk. So we do kind of outline a number of approaches to identify the risk, and also there are just some really good resources to look at, and some fantastic individuals doing great work on this topic, several of which are on this call, that we point to in the toolkit in terms of ways to get started with that risk identification piece. So then in terms of what to do about it, to Rebecca's point, we divided the toolkit up into actions that investors can take before, during, and after a conflict. And we kind of went down this path because we started thinking about what to do during a conflict, but really we know that conflicts don't happen overnight. And if companies are proactive and prepared, then they'll be in a much better position than those who fail to act prior to a conflict breaking out or escalating, in the case of Russia and Ukraine. So we included a list of questions to ask companies about their preparedness, and how proactive they are being in an area that could be prone to conflict. The next part is around sort of what we found from engaging with companies during a conflict, and I think this is really hard because once a conflict has already escalated, companies are having to trade off the human rights implications of staying or going or something in between. And there are so many mind-bending examples, like the example of the pharmaceutical company that provides that life-saving cancer medication, which on first glance might be an essential service, so perhaps they should stay in a conflict-affected area. But if there's a domestic company that also provides that service, what does that mean? Is it still an essential service? And I think there are just so many grey areas here, and there just is no one right answer, which makes the job for investors much harder once a conflict has escalated, which is why we were focused on that proactive engagement. I think there are just so many trade-offs, and often we see trade-offs when it comes to employees and how a company can best ensure the safety of its employees. Because if they're staying to do that, and a number of companies that we engaged with did say that was the case, and then we have a situation like in Russia last year where the government started to demand employee details from companies so they could conscript them into service, then there's a trade-off within that one stakeholder group, and that's just one stakeholder group before kind of getting into the trade-offs amongst different stakeholder groups that might be impacted. So Rebecca asked me to talk to the notion of a responsible exit, but I think it's such an elusive one. The only thing I would say is, and this was based on our engagement with companies, is a responsible exit definitely seems to be one where decisions are really grounded in human rights, and where the human rights implications are constantly being revisited as the situation evolves, because this is conflict-affected areas are just constantly evolving in terms of what the human rights implications are. So that was definitely a red flag that we raised in the toolkit for engaging with companies, that it isn't a one and done, both for investor engagement, but also for a company assessing that they should be doing this on an ongoing basis. And then finally, after a conflict has ended, we know that the human rights implications of conflicts are far-reaching, they are long-lasting, and they don't end when a conflict ends. So really ensuring that the company engagement should continue post-conflict, and we do include a series of questions to ask companies post-conflict, especially in areas where there are fragile government structures in place, potentially just really understanding how companies are geared up to operate in that environment. So finally, Rebecca asked me to share some lessons learned, and probably my biggest lesson was I was surprised. I know that there's going to be a further conversation between Sam and Jake on this topic, but for me, I was really surprised at the number of companies that weren't thinking about these issues from a human rights or international humanitarian law angle at all. When we engaged with companies, we got some really generic responses, or just companies were surprised that an investor was asking these questions. Which really highlighted for me how important it is for investors to signal the importance of this issue for companies, because often when they're getting questions from investors on ESG topics, it's so geared towards things like climate change. So really making it really clear how important human rights is. So I might just pause there because I think my 10 minutes are up, but looking forward to the rest of the conversation and then the Q&A later.
Oh, thank you, Kate. That was really tremendous. And you raised some really important questions, but also dilemmas, because I think you're right. There are no easy answers to many of these questions. And certainly take in particular your point that this is, conflict situations are constantly evolving, and we, have to stay on top of the dynamics and how they're changing. And even after a conflict may seem to be over, Ken research with Myanmar is a perfect example of that, right? We're all just, thinking we could go back in, there'd be investment, sound investment opportunities, and then the coup happened. So, but we'll hear more also. And I would put the link to the guide, the investor toolkit, in the chat. So I encourage everyone to take a look at that. And we'll get back to talking again in a second with Sam and Jake about that investor perspective. But I believe we have Sanisha, who is now able to join us. Sanisha, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. And I just want to first of all, I should thank all my speakers, because a lot going on, different time zones being covered, and from the very early West Coast of the United States to late night Australia and in Europe in between. So thank you for being with us. And Sanisha is currently the Business and Human Rights Specialist with the UN Development Program, and he is going to talk to us today, in particular, about the guide on heightened human rights for business and conflict-affected contexts that the UNDP put out together with the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. And so we've asked Sanisha to talk to us a little bit about that, where there's a need for heightened human rights due diligence, or why is there a need for heightened human rights due diligence in conflict-affected and high-risk settings? What are some of the red flags that businesses need to keep an eye out for to indicate they should trigger them conducting a heightened human rights due diligence process, and what some of the core elements of that process are like? And I should say, Sanisha, Kate already hinted a bit at one of the cases that kind of really shows some of the risks that companies face. That's the Lafarge case, which I think you'll also be sharing with us today. So thanks for being with us. I know you're a little under the weather, so we're particularly grateful that you're taking the time today. And Aditi, if you could pull up Sanisha's slides, I think he'll help cue you through those. So yeah, it looks like we've got those started here any second. And I'm just going to hand it over to you then, Sanisha, as soon as we get those queued up to get us started.
Thank you. Yes, hi everyone. Apologies for being late. I am Sanisha Milatovic. I'm a business human rights specialist working globally as sort of a global advisor for UNDP. And I can see we do not see the slides. Yes, I can't see them either. So you'll just have to bear with us, hopefully, for a second.
Yeah, sorry, it's coming. We're just...
Okay. I mean, I can speak extemporaneously a bit. So just to say that I'm also sorry, as I said, I'm a bit under the weather. I have COVID, so I'm sorry if I don't make any sense during the presentation at some point, but hopefully it will all come together. So I can see, yes, it's the third slide there. Third, fourth. Okay, so if we go on to the next slide, just a sort of a brief introduction into who we are. We are the UN Development Program. This is, we have offices in 170 countries around the world. These are just some of the countries where we do business and human rights programming. I'm not going to spend too long on what we do, but it's, ranges from training companies to working with governments on the development of national action plans and so on. And unfortunately, that map is now outdated. That's of a few months ago. Right now, we're at 36 countries on business and human rights. So just to let you know that, we're quite active in every region where we work on this issue. Specifically, though, on business, human rights, and conflict, as was mentioned, we issued this guide, which I'll get onto, on heightened human rights due diligence for companies, together with the UN Working Group. And yes, I did want to talk about the Lafarge case. If you can just go on to the next slide, just quickly. I can see that Kate mentioned it, but just very quickly, because it's sort of an emblematic case as to why you should care. So the facts very quickly. Lafarge acquired an Egyptian cement company, operated this in northern Syria, and unfortunately in 2011 the Syrian civil war started, and as a result, Lafarge's operations became, or rather the operations of its subsidiary operating this cement plant, became threatened by ISIS and by various other groups designated as terrorists. Employees were facing serious threats, violence, kidnapping, and so on. And eventually, what happened was that between 2012 and 2014, the Lafarge subsidiary in Syria was paying serious sums of money to these armed groups, including ISIS, to keep its plant going, which Lafarge admitted itself in 2017. And then finally, the sort of final straw came in 2014 when Islamic State took over the area in which the plant was and took over the plant itself. So where ISIS took over the plant, we see that Lafarge didn't have an evacuation plan for the employees of its plant. That this was done sort of in a chaotic manner. Employees fled in private vehicles and so on. So what is the sort of upshot of all this? Well, I mean, there's two legal processes in currently going on, or that were going on. One is before the French and the other one before American French courts, and the other one before American authorities. I think Kate mentioned that Lafarge was ordered to pay 778 million. There was ordered to pay 778 million to the U.S. government. At the same time, so if you go 3 slides down, or 2 slides down, sorry. Okay, so it was ordered to pay 778 million to the U.S. court by the U.S. courts for conspiracy to provide material support to terrorist organizations. At the same time, before the French courts, Lafarge has been charged, with crimes against humanity, its leadership, and so on, and that is unresolved. But the French courts have found that factually the Lafarge group gave permission and even instructed the LCS, which is its subsidiary, to make payments to the Islamic State, and that it should have known, basically couldn't have ignored, as the whole world knew the terrorist nature of ISIS. So why is this an emblematic case? Let me just go back to why this matters and why this need for heightened human rights due diligence. If we go on to the next slide, we see that under the UN Guiding Principles, the Guiding Principle 23 mentions that conflict-affected areas can increase the risks of companies, of enterprises being complicit in gross human rights abuses. So out of that flowed this idea of heightened human rights due diligence. As you all know, human rights due diligence was introduced by the UN Guiding Principles, but beyond that, this idea that the higher the risks, the more complex the process is required, was sort of developed and unpacked over the past 12 years since the adoption of the UN Guiding Principles. And if we go on to the next slide, we see, so the question, as I said, this idea of proportionality, right? So the higher the risk, the more complex the process is required of companies. And also there's this, which I'm sure Kate mentioned, I tuned in slightly late, but this obviously obligation of businesses to actually respect international humanitarian law as well as international human rights law in conflict-affected areas. So when you take that as a starting point, this sort of the higher the risk, the higher risk in conflict-affected areas, the more complex the process is required. The fact that businesses are bound not only by international human rights law, but international humanitarian law as well in these areas. If we go on to the next slide, we then asked ourselves, okay, so when does this obligation apply? Well, the traditional answer is in sort of regular, if you will, conflicts. So these are international and internal armed conflicts. I'm sure you can think of one in particular, international armed conflict that's been center stage for the past year and a half, which is the Russia-Ukraine war. There's various internal armed conflicts around the world. But beyond that, there's a few other situations in which, this duty to carry out so-called heightened human rights due diligence applies. And this is, if there's any gross human rights violations taking place, if there's a military occupation, if, to use the sort of term developed by the European Union for its conflict minerals regulation. So we're talking about essentially conflict affected and high risk areas, which is not a term that we use in the UN guide, but it's essentially, let's for the purposes of our discussion call it the same thing. So when you want to know whether you're operating in such an area, there's always early warning signs because conflicts never develop out of the blue. So if we go on to the next slide, just to briefly say that there's always early warning red flags. So it's not just if a conflict is, full-blown conflict, of course, it's easy to identify that you should be carrying out heightened human rights due diligence, but there's always early warning signs such as the amassing of weapons, records of serious violations of international human rights law, increased hate speech in a particular, country. I come from the former Yugoslavia. We had all of these signs before, the full-scale wars in former Yugoslavia broke out. Signs of militia recruitment, again, that was happening here as well. Expulsion or banning of various organizations and so on. So if you see this happening, you should probably be carrying out heightened human rights due diligence. In the guide, we tried for this pithy, slogan, which is probably, not as pithy as we'd like, but we say, if in doubt, carry it out. So it basically means that, if any of these are happening, you should be mindful that a full-blown conflict could, break out, or maybe breaking out as we're, as you're talking in essence, and that you should carry out heightened human rights due diligence. So what does it mean? So what is heightened human rights due diligence? If we go on to the next slide, I only have a couple of minutes left, and a lot of this is in the guide, so I'm not going to sort of go into great detail. But in brief, it's about identifying your potential or actual impacts on people, so on human rights, which is what you traditionally do, as well as on the context, so on the conflict itself. And you have the various steps here that are, some additional steps are required in addition to your traditional human rights due diligence. The centerpiece of these is to carry out a conflict analysis and update it regularly. There are organizations that can help you with this. The actual good thing about carrying out a conflict analysis is that some of this you can do jointly. It's a shared exercise because, your analysis of a conflict is likely to be very similar to the analysis of other companies, in a particular conflict. Where it differs is the fact that your company might be having a very different impact to that another company might be having on a conflict. It might be directly recruiting private security groups. It might be employing persons from a certain ethnic group and thereby, inadvertently deepening ethnic divisions or other divisions and so on. But ultimately, the conflict itself can be, the conflict analysis itself, at least the bulk of it, can be a shared exercise, a joint exercise. So it really is about you knowing not only how you're impacting human rights, but also how you're impacting the conflict, because these two can vary, and you may not even be having a negative impact on human rights, but you may be having, as I said, an inadvertent negative impact on a conflict. We can go into great detail on that. I don't want to take too much time, but just to say, if I can run through these couple of slides remaining, because I'm over time by a minute, we have in the guide, yes, the next slide, a checklist. So I'd advise you to sort of check that out, where you have the various steps that you should be taking. And if we come back to if we go on to the next slide, the Lafarge example. So had Lafarge carried out heightened human rights due diligence, what would have happened? Well, first of all, before the Syrian civil war broke out, it would have identified the conflict risks, prepared a contingency plan, including a responsible exit plan, possibly. When the war, in the phase when the war broke out from 2011 onwards, it would have identified the risk that, the lives of employees were at risk and so on. It would have closed down the plant and likely disabled it and ensured that employees were evacuated, received income, and offered a remedy for any negative impacts. And then finally, from 2014 onwards, when it lost control of the plant, obviously it is responsible for offering compensation to employees and cooperating in any remedy. And then finally, I just ask you to go 2 slides down. Rebecca mentioned the guide that we have. You can Google the following and it will come up. And obviously, we're also developing actually a training package tailored much more closely to the needs of investors and others, which will be ready in a couple of months. So I'd advise you to check that out. Okay, with that, I'll stop. I apologize if I've gone over time. Rebecca.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Sanisha. That was a really great overview of what this guide offers. And I really encourage everybody to take a closer look at it. And I like the if in doubt, carry it out, because it really helps get companies in kind of the preventative thinking mode, right? And not just reacting and being caught flat-footed, because most conflicts, there's really no excuse. It's not, they don't come out of nowhere overnight, right? There's a lot of signs. So it's good to think about some of those red flags. But with that, I'm going to hand it over now to Sam Jones, who is co-founder and president of Heartland Initiative, and Jake Barnett, who is managing director, sustainable investment strategies at Westpath Benefits Investments. And we're going to hear a little conversation between the two of them, because they have been working very closely together to think about how to more systematically approach risk identification and management across portfolio holdings for companies that are potentially active in a number of various sectors, but also conflict settings, geographies. And I think they're going to talk to us a little bit about how they go about communicating their expectations of companies in terms of what steps they should be taking in these types of contexts. And also would love to hear a little more just about how those engagements with companies have been going. What do companies get? Where is their need to do maybe more awareness raising? So I'll turn it over to you two. Thanks for being with us today.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. So yeah, and thanks to Jake. We're going from Kate, who's at 11 p.m. at night, to Jake, who's 6 a.m. in the morning. So really appreciate the time, and really want to thank both Kate and Sanisha for their comments on this critical guidance, as Kate alluded to, international humanitarian law among companies and to a degree investors, maybe one of the least well understood and least applied set of guidelines out there. So what I want to do with the conversation with Jake is really to turn this from this critical tools and guidance more to practical application, on the day-to-day with the institutional investor. And we've worked with Westpath since the beginning of Heartland. So Jake, let me start off with this. I think it's fair to say that Westpath is considered a leader in identifying and addressing the systemic environmental risk posed by climate change, including through the Climate Action 100 initiative. Why does Westpath consider business activities in conflict-affected and high-risk areas to be a systemic social risk, warranting a similar level of thought and effort?
Yeah, thank you. And great to listen to the presentations beforehand. I think that one of the pieces of information that you've shared with me, Sam, that I think really girds a lot of our thinking is that, in the years to come, the World Bank has estimated it might be by 2030 that a third of the globe is going to be in conflict affected and high risk areas. And so when you're talking about that size of footprint, that's no longer, regardless of whether you're thinking about this from a moral issue or a values issue, both of which are important to us as a faith-based investor, as a fiduciary, and somebody who's trying to understand where risk is manifesting within the portfolio, including on sustainable investment issues. That's a pretty large manifestation. And it's one that we're increasingly seeing come to bear, whether it's the Russian invasion of Ukraine or seeing increasing destabilization, including that, when we talk about our work with climate change, these are not separate and distinct issues. These are intersectional issues, in which case, the increasing climate crisis will lead to exacerbated risk in these different areas. So for us, it's about thinking globally, it's about thinking holistically, it's about thinking long-term, all of which we're prompted to do as a pension fund who's got obligations to beneficiaries through the end of the century. And as we think about those issues, this is one that we feel is important and also underappreciated in the institutional investor community.
All right, thanks for that, Jake. I think within Westpath and from the very beginning, we talked about how do we develop an approach that really considers the fact that for investors across the board, that there is a very real resource challenge, right, faced by staff in addressing myriad of E, S, and G issues in a world that's only getting riskier for people, the planet, and portfolios. So how has a focus on conflict-affected and high-risk areas enabled you to prioritize the most severe and systemic risk across that portfolio, better allocate resources, and really feel like you're making a meaningful contribution to the mitigation of human rights risk in these challenging contexts?
Yeah, it's an interesting, I think there's human rights risks that manifest throughout the portfolio. And when, I know we might talk a little bit about our engagement with asset managers, but it's been illuminating for me when I go to talk to asset managers that they might have different focuses on how they're thinking about human rights risk. So modern slavery is becoming an issue that a lot of people are focusing on. And certainly, there's going to be overlap with conflict affected and high risk areas and modern slavery, but they are two distinct issues that I would posit that the modern slavery issue is potentially a little might be an easier one to gain traction within the investor community, in part because it's a little less messy, it's a little less complex. It doesn't quite so immediately stray into large questions of geopolitics. But for us, when we started looking at what our stakeholders were interested in, having had a really concerted push amongst some in the United Methodist community to do more when it came to issues like the occupied Palestinian territories. And then when we started to recognize that the geographical, operational, relational risks and relationships, as we've talked through with you, were going to be very difficult and risk-inducing in conflict-affected and high-risk areas, it felt important for us to think through how to both understand and wrestle with that more ourselves, but also how to think through how do we bring other investors along with us in this journey? Because something we're always very focused on is, even though we're a relatively large investor in the faith-based space, we are, a drop in the bucket when it comes to larger capital markets. So for a lot of these initiatives to be effective in terms of engaging and asking for accountability from companies and trying to get broader capital markets to recognize and drive improved behavior when it comes to expectations on these issues, it's important for us that we be thinking through not only how are we doing this well ourselves, but how are we doing it well in a way that translates to bringing others along with us.
All right, I appreciate that. You had alluded to it before, but let's spend a moment just talking about sort of other stakeholders in your ESG orbit that are critical to ensuring that Westpath is fulfilling its mission, whenever and wherever possible. So can you describe how you apply to focus on CARA-based risk management to conversations with your asset managers? Because I think this is a gap within the conversation, which is already sort of a new and emerging conversation.
Yeah, so we're an institutional asset owner, meaning that we manage assets largely on behalf of beneficiaries, and we also help some Methodist affiliated institutional investors manage their assets. And the way that we deploy that capital is almost entirely through third-party asset managers. So that's your BlackRocks, your Capital Groups, your Wellingtons. Our asset manager list is publicly available online. And so when we start to think through what our role is, not only in relation to human rights risk, but this is relevant for diversity, equity, and inclusion, human capital management, climate action, we recognize that we're actually one step removed from the portfolio companies. So there's an intermediary in the form of an asset manager there. And to put it bluntly, the portfolio company cares often more about what the asset manager has to say than what we have to say. The asset manager has a higher stake in the portfolio company. They're often bringing more institutional and sector expertise they've got a longer standing relationship. And to move from kind of the soft power to the hard power, they're the ones making the buy-sell decision as to whether the portfolio company stays. However, we have all of those dynamics directly with our asset managers, in that we're the client, we've got long-standing relationships, we've got expectations and understanding of what we want from environmental, social, and governance alignment. And so the conversation for us then becomes a discussion of how do we assess and drive alignment. And, Sam, I've talked to you about this, even in accepting this webinar, but I always find it somewhat dispiriting that when we talk to our asset managers, we do hear from them, you're one of the few groups that's asking us about this. You're really a leader in this space. You're, trying to push it forward. And I say it's dispiriting because we're just trying to ask questions at this point. And we're trying to better understand how they're thinking about risk. And we certainly benefit from having you all often in those conversations. And that sometimes takes a little nuancing, because they're like, who is this NGO you're trying to bring in that we don't know about to a conversation? Asset managers might be a little wary about that, but we tell them this is the group that we're doing engagement with, and they have expertise to bring to you. So I think if you're an asset owner, it's really important that you don't just do the portfolio company engagement. To some extent, even though that's really difficult work, I would argue it's still maybe the easier work to do, because the higher stakes decision you can make as an asset owner, if you are externally managed, is how are you messaging and materially following up on this being an expectation you have for your managers. We're in the early days of that. It's still evolving for us, but it's been a really important and I think productive conversation.
Thanks, Jake. I want to be attentive to the time and turn it over to our colleagues from IRIS. But before closing, I just wanted to mention, and this is part of Heartland and Westpath's ongoing partnership, but Westpath, Heartland, and the UK-based asset management firm Schroders are currently developing a white paper that's going to detail the ways in which salient human rights risks associated with business activities in conflict-affected and high-risk areas translate into financially material risk for companies and investors. And the paper will actually highlight what we've all been discussing here today, that essentially systemic risk demands a systemic mitigation strategy, so that already vulnerable populations living in these areas and companies working in these communities can both benefit from rights respecting and conflict sensitive business conduct. That white paper should be published by the end of the year. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Rebecca and to Sam and Peter.
Thank you. Thank you both. And thank you for letting us kind of listen in on your conversation. And, Jake, I think Westpath is definitely a forerunner. So really appreciate you, bringing these questions to the attention of asset managers. And Sam, thanks for sharing that information about the forthcoming white paper. I also see in the chat, there's a number of resources that are being shared there. So folks, please do continue to put those resources in the chat. Sam, we can gladly send that white paper out to this audience and beyond as well when that's published. So that's tremendous. And also, if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat as well. And you can also, during the Q&A, raise your hand. But before we get to the Q&A, I want to briefly turn things over to Sam Chua. Sam Chua is with the IRIS Conflict Risk Network, and she's going to be talking to us about a new investor commitments on conflict that IRIS is developing. So Sam, over to you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Rebecca and the IAHR team for including us in this webinar. The IRIS Conflict Risk Network, or CRN, is a nonprofit organization that is part of the IRIS Foundation. We work on advocacy, advisory, and research services for and with investors on the topic of conflict. Some of you may already know us for our work on Sudan and Myanmar, but today I'm here to talk to you about our most recent project, the Investor Commitments on Conflict. These commitments are similar to the Just Transition commitments because they call investors to action. At the onset of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a number of investors were hesitant to sign on to calls to divest from companies with business activities in the region. This hesitation arose partly due to the concern that it may reflect a double standard in relation to how investors react to conflict, such as Yemen or potentially Taiwan, and a recognition that while every conflict is different, there is also a need for some level of consistency in approach. So this is where the investor commitments on conflict comes in. The goal is really to help provide consistency and set a standard of action towards conflict-affected investments. And I guess also to echo what Kate has said earlier, it also signals to companies how important the issue of conflict is to investors. I realized that a while ago, Jake was saying Westpath already engages with NGOs, and that's great. I think Westpath is a leader in this space, but this is also to help other investors, follow that path, to be leaders in the conflict space as well. So without further ado, the commitments are composed of 4 main pillars, really, and stand or are based on more general overarching ones. I will not read the commitments out to you right now in the interest of time. But the 3 general commitments focus mainly on the recognition of conflict by investors as a material investment risk and the integration of conflict sensitivity into existing responsible investment policies and seizing or capitalizing on any knowledge building opportunities as what we are doing right now. So built on top of these base commitments are 4 pillars. The first one would be transparency, and Jake has already talked about this when he shared a bit of his experience with asset managers that they work on. But this really emphasizes the importance of openness between asset owners and asset managers regarding their policies on conflict and their expectations in regard to those policies. The second pillar, which is integration, is really all about investors understanding and incorporating the effects of conflict into their investment analysis by identifying any conflict-affected investments they might have in their portfolios. Conflict-affected investments may include any holdings which have been connected to causing, contributing, or being linked to a conflict, either directly or indirectly. The third pillar, engagement, focuses on identifying and communicating with the most appropriate stakeholders. And this would not only include companies, but it may also include NGOs or home governments. But when investors do engage with companies, it's important that they ask questions about heightened human rights due diligence. They also ask whether the companies have readily available exit strategies, as well as their efforts to mitigate or prevent complicity in any conflict-related harms. And of course, the last pillar, which is divestment, is really all about investors setting their own red lines for when complicity in human rights abuses in conflict or international crimes will lead to divestment. Setting the parameters for what would constitute divestment would be useful in the long run because it can provide a higher level of consistency. So that's basically a whole summary of the commitments. If you're interested in learning more and becoming a founding signatory, please reach out to me. You can get my email from Rebecca, but you can also access our website, iriscrn.net. Right now, we're in the process of pooling founding signatories, and we will move on to making the document more publicly available once we have a set of founding signatories. But yeah, thank you again, everyone. Sorry, I had to breeze through that, but hopefully, yeah, you got a good
great
idea.
No,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Sam. That's great, and really excited to hear about the fact that you guys are developing this investor commitment. And please do, if you could, pop your email address into the chat so people know that they can reach out to you directly. So we're going to go over to the Q&A. It'd be great if all of the speakers could go back on camera. There's already been 2 questions that have come in, as well as a point made here by Antje Schneeweiss. She points out that with regards to engaging asset managers doing business in the EU now have to actually report annually under the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation and the Principal Adverse Impact Statement, what percentage of their investee companies are linked to human rights violations and which percentage do not have human rights due diligence processes in place. So that could be something that since they're starting to already do that reporting, that could be something that'd be very useful in that dialogue. But also on that note, I wanted to just toss a question out to Sam and Jake, and that is, can you tell us a little bit about your portfolio of company engagements? I know that we talked about kind of more addressing the systemic risks, across your holdings, but can you give us a little flavor of what those kind of like one-on-one engagements have been going, how they've been going? What level of awareness was there amongst the companies you've been engaging? Where do you see that they're having some of their biggest challenges?
Jake, do you want to take this or do you want me to?
You can go, Sam, and then I'd like to add something on. Well, I'd like to actually respond just quickly to the comment that was made that I think is important, and then I'll let you speak to the conversation. And this is relevant for some of the portfolio company engagements that Sam will talk about. But there's a lot of distance at times between the transparent policy and disclosures that people talk about in what I call their glossy brochure language, and then the implementation of what that looks like on the ground. So I absolutely agree with that individual in terms of the type of transparency and disclosure that's being prompted by EU and different policies is as a positive development for asset managers. But similar to sometimes what Sam has said to me of, companies get good at speaking UN GPEs. And I think that we've seen the same thing in the asset manager community. We've seen instances where there's a high-level statement of general alignment with UN GPs, but then you also need to go and look at the individual portfolio companies and holdings and say, how did this portfolio company, for example, one of the conversations we had was prompted by getting a portfolio company, noticing it come into the portfolio, and it had direct connections to the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And that is part of what kicked off our conversation, is that it wasn't just connections, it was actually connections and controversies associated with it. And so I would just encourage people not only to look at that high level information, but to follow it up with specific, when you have capacity, look through the portfolio and challenges to the asset manager of how did that policy translate to this holding? And specifically asking the portfolio managers where possible, because I think that's where the rubber meets the road on some of this.
Yeah, listen, I would say just quickly, Kate nailed it in her opening remarks, that there is a very little understanding among multinational companies about their responsibilities under international humanitarian law. They're not conversant in it. I think what we found in our engagements that not only are they not conversant in it, but there's a real reticence to develop conflict-affected and high-risk area policy as part of their global human rights policy, because there's a fear it will inhibit market entry into certain high-risk markets. So they don't want to talk about thresholds. They don't want to talk about things like that. And they often also sort of isolate. You have the ESG unit that has a human rights element, but that's isolated from operational security, from legal compliance, from other governance units across the companies. And so you also have to deal with that siloing. However, I do think that we have found far more receptivity over the last couple of years due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the coup in Myanmar, by presenting it to the company as their full risk universe of conflict-affected high-risk areas. So we don't ask a company for a better Russia-Ukraine policy or a better Burma policy. It's a better conflict-sensitive policy set of practice and governance measures. And when you're presenting it as a whole and including the individual issues that come up, that tend to come up more in these particular settings, they're more receptive to have that conversation because it's a higher percentage of revenue, higher percentage of operations, and especially when you demonstrate broad-based investor interest in this issue, we are seeing those conversations. Some very surprising companies are actually rising to the occasion as they've taken sort of these emerging geopolitical risks more seriously. but there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, it's like heartening, but there is a couple who should be rising to the occasion who potentially are not, without naming names right now. But thanks, Sam. Thanks, Jake. Sanisha, actually, I'm going to turn to you. There's a question here. I'm going to hope that you can address this from Liza Young. She asks, how do you bridge the gap between business and human rights and anti-corruption agendas in conflict-affected areas? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's a very good question because we've been asking ourselves the same question. So I have lots of thoughts, but lots of questions, but few answers, unfortunately. I mean, obviously, we've seen some of this work starting to coalesce. You have the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights report on corruption, which highlighted the various impacts that corruption can have on the enjoyment of human rights and so on, and this sort of nexus between the increase in corruption and human rights abuses and so on, especially the way that corruption affects the most marginalized groups because they have fewer access to resources and so on. You have, I think, Principles of Responsible Investment, maybe even a decade ago now, issued this guide for businesses in conflict-affected areas where it mentions corruption, but my sense is it did so in passing. It was more like, corruption. There should be policies adopted against corruption. There should be guidelines followed, et cetera, et cetera. So it was stating, I don't say the obvious, but, it was talking in generalities. Now we see, I mean, clearly, I think what we should distinguish is corruption during the conflict, in the post-conflict phase, and so on. I think that there should be sort of thought given to that because in the post-conflict phase, corruption can be a major, obviously, impediment to recovery and so on. During the conflict itself, I mean, I think it's very difficult to talk about the effects of corruption because, I mean, I don't know that there's a straight through line as to, what works and how. I mean, clearly, there's a causal effect. I mean, corruption can cause, major human rights abuses, dry conflict, and so on. But there are some. I mean, I know of some conflict-affected areas where it's almost taboo to talk about corruption at present because that's seen as perhaps an impediment to war efforts, if I can put it that way. Maybe I'm being a bit obtuse. I mean, I guess I'm saying that it's not always seen as the thing that needs to be tackled immediately. Like there are higher priorities such as preventing serious violations of international human rights law, violations of international humanitarian law, crimes against humanity, and so on. So I mean, all of this, I just maybe illustrated my thought process. I don't know how coherent that answer was. In brief, I think, we'll be possibly coming out with a bit more on that next year. Actually, it's something we've been thinking about. But at the moment, I'm not sure how to sort of bridge the gap, if you will. Yeah, so that's the brief answer. I also see there's another question for me. I don't know. I don't mind.
Yeah,
I don't know if you want to take it. Yeah,
Yes.
If there's a newsletter. There isn't a newsletter. I mean, that's a very good idea, but I think this is actually now coming back to Rebecca. I will definitely notify Rebecca, and Rebecca and I are going to talk about this a bit more in the week to, next week maybe, or in the weeks to come. So you will find that about it, through Rebecca, I think, if I can sort of, speak on her.
We'll gladly share it. Yeah. And I was going to suggest that we also, what we'll do is we're sending all of you a follow-up email, and we'll call the resources that you're all mentioning in the chat to include in that email, so you all have them in one place. So if others have any kind of resources that are available now that you'd like to share, please put those in the chat. We've only got 3 minutes left, and I'm sorry, we'll also collect the questions because we simply won't be able to get all of those in the remaining 3 minutes. But I did see that there were 2 in particular addressed to Jake. One, Jake, was with regards from August Engstrom with regards to children's rights. If you've included those in any way in your conversations with asset managers, given that children are particularly obviously a vulnerable group in conflicts, and I guess how you're basically, looks like, embedding those questions into broader human rights. My chat function is going a little bit out of control here. Broader human rights topics. And then there was also a question from Claire Richards. To what extent are you also raising or hearing from asset managers about the scrutiny of civic rights as red flags in conflict and fragility, freedom of association, free press dynamic? Sorry, I'm having issues with my chat. Yeah, looks just basically, I think, how far and to what extent civic rights are red flags that are being paid attention to by asset managers. And I'll hand that
Yeah,
over to you, Jake.
I think in the couple of minutes that's left, I'll just share, you know, we're pretty, as I've tried to be transparent about ourselves, pretty early in our journey. I think these are really valid and worthwhile questions. But it's, you know, we've been at the level of talking through with them, you know, how are you thinking through the Russian invasion of Ukraine? How are you thinking through dual use technology? Ultimately, I do think, though, that regardless of what topic you're bringing up, whether it's civic rights or children's rights or these different issues, really what you're trying to get a sense of is how are they thinking about risk, and how are they aligning with your values. And so while our focus has been more on some of the kind of live conflicts and issues relating to you know, surveillance technology, which are both areas of expertise that we're grateful to be able to lean on Heartland for, that to us is also indicative of how are you thinking about risk more broadly. So it's, you know, ultimately each institution is probably going to need to choose where their kind of point is, where they want to stand to try to push the world. And you know, just in the recognition of practical reality, it's going to be really difficult to have expertise in every single area of human rights because it's a really rich and complex tableau. But I think the more that you get a little bit more sophisticated on what good risk management looks like and what good values alignment looks like, the better equipped you'll be able to have conversations in each of those areas as they arise.
Great. And Sam, I think you wanted just 30 seconds to say something to Claire's question as well.
So really quickly to Claire's question. So we're in the process of updating it, but we developed a conflict affected and high risk areas index, which looks at some of those very indicators that Claire's referring to: domestic, political, and civil rights, global level of peacefulness, like as reflected in defense spending, corruption, of course, Freedom House, and a number of other of indicators. And so when we see a portfolio company or its value chain partner operating in a severe or high risk country or territory, that's an immediate flag, you know, that could signal the need for potential engagement. Also, just quickly to Nicholas's question from Myanmar around leverage, and you know what we found to be really useful, I would say, especially in the wake of the coup in Myanmar and the Russian invasion, is gathering increasingly large coalitions of investors to approach companies around their human rights risk and conflict affected areas, because it's easy enough usually to single out one investor, deal with them separately. But for example, the engagement with Total Energies around Myanmar, that was around 42 investors with over 4 trillion assets under management. And so those groups are harder to ignore.
Yeah, no point taken. And that's something that the Investor Alliance hopes to do, is to use that collective investor leverage as well. So, and I think also just with regards to kind of indicators, red flags, I think there's some useful things in the toolkit that RIAA has created as well. So encourage everyone again to look at that. Thank you for your questions. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We will be gathering those. We'll try to answer those also in the response in the email that we'll send out with all of these wonderful resources, with recording as well. I want to thank our speakers again, especially given how early, how late, and how unwell, unfortunately, some of us are. So really appreciate it. And I hope this was a valuable conversation. And there will be follow-up, as we've already heard from Sanisha, training, Sam, new publications, existing publications. So look forward to taking this conversation forward with all of you. Thanks so much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.